The UN's current mission in South Sudan, or UNMISS, began in 2011 and it was just recently extended until April of next year. South Sudan is in a critical humanitarian position. Its violent conflict between a corrupt government and militia groups has further intensified since early of this year. There have been thousands of civilians killed, injured, victims of sexual and gendered violence, as well as a mass displacement of peoples across the country. The UN estimates around 7.5 million people have acute food insecurity, and so UN intervention and UNMISS efforts have been critical despite the increased struggle to bring peace and adequate political infrastructure. UNMISS is authorized under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to use all means to fulfill the following tasks at large. These are facilitate humanitarian aid, protect civilians, support peace process and political stability, and monitor human rights and accountability. Of course, there are a number of nuances within these broader tasks, but this is what the UN has been and continues to fight for in South Sudan. The UN has recently acknowledged a deep funding crisis due to member states falling behind in their peacekeeping contributions. 15% of annual budgets have been reduced, which means 25% less civilian and uniformed personnel allocated for peacekeeping missions. Budget cuts are a reality to be prepared for. But this does not mean the mission cannot be successful in South Sudan. It does mean, however, certain areas will need to tighten up and increase their efficiency. UNMISS's current budget from July 1st to June 2026 is a whopping $1.2 billion, slightly less than it was in 2024. This budget is largely spent on military and police personnel costs, so deploying military personnel or peacekeepers, reimbursing police contributing countries, so countries that have offered personnel to aid South Sudanese police forces. Just today, actually, 99 naval staff peacekeepers were deployed to South Sudan, so this area of the budget is persistently being used. The second area is civilian personnel costs, so staffing and paying UN civilian staff that is employed on the mission. And thirdly, operational requirements such as logistics, transportation, infrastructures, facilities, accommodations, humanitarian aid, equipment, communication, and IT, to name a few. A $240 million loss of resources, or 20% loss, would mean UNMISS would need to pivot in key ways and would more than likely prolong UNMISS and the crisis at large. I believe maintaining as much funding as possible towards humanitarian aid and human rights protection efforts is critical. The following cuts can be made in these areas. The first is freeze hiring and allocating new troops to UNMISS and instead focusing on empowering and building on the current personnel. So use frugal tactics to continue to train and deploy qualified peacekeepers and troops and keep them on the ground as much as possible. Secondly, cut back on troops and police contingents, so scale back the day-to-day peacekeeping and policing patrols as much as possible. Third, reduce aviation operations as much as possible. UNMISS relies very heavily on helicopter transportation because the terrain in South Sudan is very rough, but aviation operations are quite expensive and would need to be scaled back. Fourth and lastly, eliminate as many upgrades, training, increased workload as possible before cutting back on humanitarian aid and human rights monitoring. I would argue, given the sensitive nature of the civilians' crisis, budget cuts should focus on the back end and operational side before they touch the human rights efforts and humanitarian aid resources. The mission would most likely be delayed, but still accomplishable with a 20% budget cut. To make the mission more efficient in line with the Security General's reform agenda, I would take the following steps. First, make decision-making and delegation efficient, immediate, and applicable across functions. There should be conscious, outward efforts to empower the head of mission, force commander, mission leaders, troops, and volunteers to make quick and efficient operational decisions top-down. This applies to any and every decision that might come. Reallocating resources, shifting patrol enforcement and deployment, reallocating humanitarian aid, moving human rights efforts and stations when and where necessary. This mission is constantly evolving, and each member, despite their ranking, needs to be aware of the power their decisions hold and possess the skills to make them in an informed manner under pressure. As we saw in Libya, a huge reason why this mission was unsuccessful was due to the absence of a unified internal strategy. Top down from the Security Council members to UNMISS leaders and troops, there needs to be efficient delegation and synchronized internal strategy at all times. Secondly, streamline policies, procedures, and logistics processes. simplify and amplify the ways in which supplies, equipment, and services are distributed and obtained. So, medical resources, for example, instead of relying on one main outpost for all medical aid, distribute aid across a diversified map to ensure that these resources are more easily accessible and to eliminate unnecessary travel across mission bases. From an administrative end, tailor procedures to adjust to real-time field conditions instead of only accounting for what goes on at headquarters or what the Security Council is being briefed on. What works in Congo may not work in South Sudan, just as well as what works for one team or base in South Sudan may not work for another. Procedures need to adapt swiftly and constantly, and every member should be vetted on current conditions and subsequent changes. Third, improve alignment of resources and mandates. This aligns with accountability, transparency, and simplification. UNMISS priorities can shift daily due to the fragile nature of the conflict. So one day, if a major flood has occurred, humanitarian access may be priority, while the next day a major political shift might occur, such as earlier this year when James Iga was removed as vice president. UNMISS must shift resources and internal alignment swiftly in the face of any and all aspects that affect the mission. Performance metrics should be tracked, and communication measures should be streamlined top-down. Fourth, consolidate support services. So instead of each field mission requiring a reinvention of logistics, administrative efforts, and supply chain, draw on a synchronized method of support that can be applicable despite the crisis or task at hand. Headquarters is responsible for overall direction, leadership, and reports, while each base has the infrastructure to support any and all missions. Peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, political guidance, human rights protection, they're all equipped for it all. Finally, but most importantly, improve transparency, accountability, and reporting. Every single member of UNMISS is monitored and responsible for understanding their own task and the mission at large at all times. This means daily briefings, consistent and efficient updates, streamlined hierarchy of leadership, explicit risk management efforts that are holistic but also tailored to each department and mission. This is largely administrative, but also should be ingrained in the culture of UNMISS troops. There's an understanding that everyone holds each other accountable and aware at all times. For exit strategy, obviously any UN mission's exit strategy will depend heavily on the political climate in which they are leaving the country. For UNMISS, because the political climate is so fragile and South Sudan politicians have largely resisted the UN's efforts thus far, an exit strategy is especially fragile. Overall, withdrawal will require obvious and verifiable progress on the revitalized peace agreement. The failure to do this concretely is why this mission continues to be extended, but it largely has to do with their inability to implement successful political structures in South Sudan. South Sudan's leaders neglect to put the nation's and the people's interests first, and there is virtually zero public trust in the current government. So withdrawing would require a political strategy that focuses on securing strong political leaders, strengthening government structures, mainly police and protection forces, enabling and outlining successful political roadmaps, and obviously reducing armed conflict, displacement, famine. As we saw in Libya, the UN mission had no central government to partner with, and this fragmentation meant there were no unified or legitimate political powers for UNSMIL to partner with. This thus far has been the case in South Sudan as well, and so the political scene is crucial for success. I argue that a ceasefire between government and militia groups is absolutely necessary before an exit strategy can occur, followed by a strong president of integrity that has garnered the trust of the Security Council, followed by political leaders of the same stature in office to rebuild trust and create appropriate infrastructure. This starts with promoting and fostering relationships with Riek Machar, the first vice president, who, although has been involved in some rather controversial matters, has displayed general capabilities to be a suitable leader and political figure to promote peace. But this means intentional and consistent action by UNMISS to foster this relationship and promote him as a healthy leader. More so, leadership success needs to be built across ethnic and regional lines, and fair elections have to be implemented and followed over an extended period of time to avoid a return to conflict. There are a number of steps UNMISS has taken to incorporate the women, peace, and security agenda and also address the extremely prevalent issues of sexual exploitation and abuse of women and children. The first is by building safe houses for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. These are currently in Yi River County and Central Equatoria, which are specifically sensitive areas for these issues. They provide shelter and trauma resources for victims. The second is through outreach, awareness, and community engagement efforts. During 16 Days of Activism, a global campaign led by the UN to end gender-based violence, which runs yearly, UNMISS's Conduct and Discipline team joined women's groups in Juba to host a workshop to raise awareness on UN's zero tolerance policy and to educate young women on sexual exploitation and abuse. They taught them how to report and emphasized harmful cultural practices such as forced marriage and genital mutilation. UNMISS has also encouraged and facilitated dialogue for women to report sexual abuse and gender violence to POC, Protection of Civilian Sites, so that these reports can be directly implemented, inform UNMISS's efforts, and processed so more real-time data can be obtained. UNMISS has also trained investigators to particularly investigate and better understand sexual abuse and gender-based violence in the area. So great efforts are being made to mitigate sexual violence in South Sudan, but there is plenty more still to be done. Power rivalries have greatly affected UNMISS and are largely why the mission has been extended through 2027 already. South Sudan has a number of political military rivalries that are largely ethnic-based and very fragile in nature. In 2018, UNMISS's peace deal called RARCSS tried to implement a unity government, but this agreement is still presently being implemented because of tensions amongst politicians that have led to a number of political arrests and ongoing conflicts. Pakistan, China, and Russia actually abstained from the Security Council's renewal of the mission in May of this year because the UNMISS mission did not adequately account for on-the-ground needs, which are affected by intense conflict and violence, but their leaders are in constant political conflict. As we saw in Rwanda in 2004, a large reason why this mission failed was because the UN's mandate was too weak to stop the level of violence that was at hand, and intelligence was ignored or dismissed. We see this happening here in South Sudan, where the bigger picture seems to be disconnected from what is really happening on the ground, and internal conflicts are not being mitigated and resolved quickly enough, which has led to thousands of deaths. So it is critical that UNMISS becomes more efficient at regulating and deconflicting internal conflicts, particularly between government and militia groups. In March of this year, South Sudan was on the brink of yet another civil war due to tension between those aligned with President Kiir clashing with those aligned with Vice President Machar. Both have seldom abided by the peace deal. When this happened in March, it forced UNMISS into a difficult position as the task became a civilian protection and mediation, understanding how to mitigate an active breakdown of the political military order that was at present. So conflict continues to slow down UNMISS and cause the mission's priorities to pivot due to leaders that continue to incite and refuse to uphold the peace measures UNMISS tries to enforce. Because national security is so fractured across regional and ethnic lines in South Sudan, authority and infrastructure is constantly in a weakened state, and so UNMISS has to persistently navigate shifts in alliances, distrust in politicians, and violence at any given time. This makes it difficult to streamline the mission and maintain any sense of stability. And considering what is happening in South Sudan, how innocent people and civilians are dying, I resonate greatly with how Samantha Powers felt when she saw Bosnian Serbs being killed in 1994. I think, like Powers, what is happening in South Sudan absolutely warrants a domestic outcry. UNMISS efforts, although they have made progress, are not enough to truly combat these issues, as they've shown. It takes our world leaders stepping up and speaking out on the atrocities that are occurring, and if necessary, taking necessary military action to protect the innocent people of South Sudan. Thank you.